Nearly every day I get a message from a younger person who is struggling with gambling. They feel like they're maybe losing control of their gambling, or they are indeed developing a gambling addiction. And there seems to be a growing epidemic, certainly here in the UK, but I'm sure this extends worldwide. What I want to do in this video, aside from talking about the reasons for this, is more importantly address directly those young people who do watch my videos who might be struggling with gambling or just being a bit concerned that their gambling is getting out of their own control, and tell you why you're not alone. While there should be no real shame in this, how it's absolutely fixable, and also give you a little bit of good news, if there is to have any good news, around your gambling addiction at your age. Now, this will involve me needing to put my old man hat on and, say, all back in my day and all that sort of stuff. So if you can forgive me that, and you can see through the fact that I am getting older and balding and all the rest of it, right? I was, a younger person who picked up a gambling addiction in my early teens. So trust me, I've been there, and I have the power of hindsight, if not the power of hair regrowth, okay, to hopefully help you understand your addiction a little bit better and start to sort of make those changes, which ultimately is going to mean that the rest of your life is going to be free of this crippling addiction. I won't do my normal self-promotion thing, but I will say hope you're keeping safe, hope you're keeping sane, and I'll talk more about the channel and Patreon and all that sort of stuff at the end. But I think it's critical to sort of just dive into this one. And firstly say, if you are a younger person, and by young I mean not just younger than me, that's quite a lot of people, but maybe you're still at school, at college, late teens, early 20s, just gone out into the world of work, and suddenly you've got disposable income, which you're finding it incredibly easy to dispose of. So if you think I'm actually still young, I'm having a problem with gambling, then you're not alone. As I said at the very front end of this video, I get messages virtually every day from younger people asking my advice on abstinence from gambling, or saying that they're starting to develop a bit of an unhealthy relationship with gambling. So it's fairly safe to say that you're not alone in that. And there's no shame. Gambling is thankfully becoming more and more accepted as an addiction. People are starting to realise more and more the dangers that gambling holds for people of all ages. Okay, and it's not surprising that gambling is becoming a problem for younger people. Now, this is the first time in this video where I get to put my old person hat on and say, back in my day, right? Back in my day, gambling was seen as a sort of an underground dirty vice. It was the sort of thing that old men with flat caps smoking cigars would do in bookmakers. Gambling now has become significantly more accessible. I mean, there are bookmakers on virtually every parade of shops, every high street. There'll be multiples. It's available online, everywhere. Gambling is in your face all the time. But not only is it massively available now, it's also promoted as a sort of a harmless recreational activity. And apart from the odd when the fun stops stop platitude thrown in for good measure, and only because they're made to, it's promoted as a sort of a social, fun and relatively harmless activity. So it's not unreasonable that people who've grown up with this saturation of gambling, and that gambling being promoted from every angle, will grow up to believe that gambling is something we can try, is something we can partake in on a leisurely basis, and although we may have this sort of idea that gambling is highly addictive, quite often this when the fun stops narrative is completely irrelevant, because by the time we realise the fun's stopped, the damage has already been done, the seeds of the addiction have already been planted, and we're already spending far too much time and money on this addiction. So there is no shame in the fact that you've fallen into the very trap that the gambling industry is setting for you. In the same way that people took up smoking in the sort of any post-war era, whatever, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, because it was heavily promoted. It was seen as a cool social thing to do, and whilst sometimes the early indications of health implications may have been there, they were certainly downplayed, and smoking, the overwhelming social attitude towards smoking was certainly not a negative one, and in many cases, from a sort of fashion perspective, shall we say, it was a positive one. It was seen as a cool thing to do. So there's no shame in falling into the trap that's blatantly been set for you, which is immoral and all the rest of it. And actually, I will mention very quickly, of course, if you're gambling under the age of legal requirement in this country, that there should be greater regulation, there should be greater restriction, and there should be the application of the law in more circumstances in order to prevent you from doing this. But that is a ridiculous thing to blame this epidemic on. The reason being, when I was underage, I did tons of things I shouldn't have been doing at that age. I did tons of things I shouldn't have probably been doing at any age, but that's a story for another day. All right. Yes, bookies should be a lot tighter on who they let into their shops to play the fob teas. Yes, online casinos should do more background checks on people to make sure they are not using their parents' credit card, that they are of a legal age. And yes, pubs should stop young people from playing fruit machines and all the rest of it, right? There is blame in many, many places. Okay, but to blame that is just sort of foolhardy, really. Now, the other reason I believe that young people are susceptible to gambling addiction, and this is another old man hat thing, right, is that young people these days are bombarded with constant instant hits of dopamine instant gratification. Media has been boiled down to short bite-sized segments, in the case of TikTok or X, as I believe Twitter is now called, for some reason, best only known to Elon. It's boiled down into these little snapshots of instant hit, instant hit, instant hit. So it's no surprise that we have a generation of young minds that have been set up to constantly feed the dopamine receptors in your brain with this hit after hit after hit after hit. I'd hate to be a young person in society today. And, you know, like I say, the old person thing would be to say, oh, kids these days don't know how good they've got it. And in some respects, life is very accessible, it's very comfortable, it's very convenient. But in many respects, it's those very factors that make it so dangerous and make people so susceptible to addictions of all kinds. The other thing I'd say is that when I was when I was a younger person, we got talked about at school and at college and all the rest of it about the dangers of drugs, of alcohol, of cigarettes, of all the rest of it, okay? And we were told, don't do these things, these are really bad things. We were never told about gambling. And if we were, then the advice invariably, as it was with cigarettes and alcohol and recreational drugs, the advice is shit, for want of a better word. Generally speaking, advice around any vice or addiction or bad negative behaviour in schools and colleges and focused on young people is don't do this, this is bad. I was told at school constantly, don't take drugs, drugs are bad. You know, don't drink, drinking's bad. Don't smoke, cigarettes are bad. And by the time I was of legal age of any of those things, I'd done them all. Alright, so that's how fucking useless that sort of advice is. So for me to come out here, and anyone to come out here and say, gambling's bad, don't do it, particularly when bombarded with advertising to say something quite to the contrary, is a complete waste of fucking time, right? Also, the psychology of life, and this isn't just teenagers, or teenagers and young people are blamed for it more, the danger of life is if you're told something is bad and wrong, then somehow you want to try it a bit more. It becomes a bit more appealing, a bit more exciting. You're like, well, I'll make up my own bloody mind as to whether or not this is bad for me or not. I'll give it a go. So hopefully it will take someone who's old and weathered like me and who's got the scars from it to tell you, look, you're going to try it, right? You're going to try gambling, you're going to try smoking, you're going to try alcohol, you're going to try whatever, right? You're probably going to try a lot of things in your life. And most of them probably won't stick, which is great. But if you do choose to gamble, then just be very, very acutely aware of when that gambling may become or start to become a problem. I could sit here and tell you don't do it, but you're probably at some point going to try it. And if you watch this video, you already have. All right? So I'm not going to go too much into the advice I normally give about how to address a gambling addiction if you are a young person who's decided that you have a problem with gambling, that your relationship with gambling has become a bit of a bad one, a bit of a toxic relationship, if I'm going to try and be down with the kids and use the modern lingo, right? Which I really shouldn't. There's no shame in it, but the backside of that is that there's tons of support out there. Okay, not just me, but there's loads of links in the description to this. And like I say, it's become more and more accepted now as a legitimate dependency, as a psychological issue, rather than just something you should just stop doing. So I'm not going to go too much into the advice about blocks and what have you. Watch my other videos if you want genuine practical advice as to how to restrict your ability to gamble. I will say that blocks are key, communication is key, and breaking the sort of time, money, availability triangle is key. But like I say, so much advice about that online, not just from me, but from tons of different sources. So I won't bore you with all that now. But it is definitely worth doing some reading about the practical things you can do to prevent yourself from gambling, at least in the very, very short term and in the early stages of what we would deem your recovery. Let's talk about the good news. And yes, there is some good news. If you are a young person, and like I say, young is subjective, the good news is thus. Unlike people like myself who took into their sort of late 30s before they got into recovery, you have time massively on your side. When I get stories from young people in the comment section and people who message me, what they'll often say is this: I've just lost XYZ amount of money and that's all the money I had. Now, I'm not here to belittle younger people. There are younger people who are earning far, far more money than me. And there's some very, very successful young people financially. However, generally speaking, the messages I get talking about the monetary loss, which as we know isn't the most important thing, but it is a thing, the amounts are significantly lower than those messages I get from people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. It's significantly lower than those older people. So they've actually lost less money. Now, what does this mean? Well, firstly, it means there's less financial damage to undo. It also means you have developed and you have accepted and acknowledged the dangers of gambling, and you have maybe accepted within yourself that you are unable to control this behaviour at a point in your life before you've been able to create too much financial carnage, before you've able to build up a ton of gambling debt, or what is going to be over the course of the rest of your life a relatively insignificant amount of gambling debt, compared to someone who has remortgaged the house and has been gambling for the last 20 years and borrowed from every, available avenue. Yes, it might be that you've just turned 18, you've got a credit card and you spunked a lot on online casinos. It happens. That would have been me had such a facility been available when I was that age. Okay, but two things financially, and I know the financial implications aren't the most serious issues around gambling addiction, but they are seemingly the biggest immediate issue when you are, coming to terms with the problems you've created for yourself. Firstly, you will have had comparatively few opportunities to borrow money. You would have built up many fewer savings compared to someone who may have, have been gambling for many, many years. Also, and most critically, you have by far and away the most time left to address these problems, repay them, get back onto parity, and then rebuild. If you're 50 and you've got 50 grand's worth of debt, it's going to take you probably 10 years at least to pay that off. Okay, and then you've got to rebuild your credit, and by the time you're actually sort of in a solid parity position, maybe you're nearing retirement, and it's affected a significant portion of your life. If you're 20, 18, 15, 17, whatever, 20, whatever, and you build up however much debt, it may take you a similar amount of time because of lower earnings or whatever to pay off. But then you will have the rest of your life to reform, rebuild, crack on with, and here's the key point, with the knowledge that you develop much younger in life. And that is that gambling is dangerous, it's highly addictive, and that you personally can't do it on a recreational level. So, just hypothetically, if having played Fruit Machine since I was sort of 13 or even before, I'd got to the age of 18 and I would realise that I had a problem with this. I knew I had a problem with this, I just hadn't addressed it, right? I probably would have had maybe a couple of grand in debt that I'd got my first credit card and all the rest of it. I could have paid that off by the time I was probably 18 and a half, 19. And I would have known I had a gambling addiction, I can't gamble, I've got into recovery, and I would be in a far, far better position for it now as a 40-odd-year-old than, I am. Instead, I waited 20 years more, probably the best part of 20 years more, then addressed it, and it's going to take me even longer to repay the damage I've done, but also to then set myself on a solid footing for the rest of my life. And that said, I am in a better position than someone 10 years my senior. So the great news is it's been an expensive lesson, but it has been a lesson. You have learned it. It's a lesson hopefully you can carry with you for the rest of your life. You can continue down the path of gambling abstinence. You can realise that actually this is, a waste of your time, a waste of your money, and it has got the ability to damage the rest of your life if you don't address it now. But you have time on your side. You have knowledge on your side. You've made a realisation that many, many people would love to have made years and years earlier, decades earlier. So I want to wish you all the best in your recovery, okay? There are tons of videos on this channel about the practical steps you can take to stopping gambling. I made one not that long ago about stopping gambling addiction, and that has a lot of the key things you can possibly look at, in order to sort of kickstart your recovery. But dare I say, communication is key. But thankfully, like I say, it's a much more open conversation now than it ever was. And there are more tools and stuff out there now to help prevent your gambling. So remember, you're not alone. There is no shame. This is a trap you've been forced to fall into by promotion, by addiction, and by normalisation of gambling, and also other societal factors and social media and all that sort of stuff. You're not alone. There is no shame. You've realised it in good time, and that is the good news. You have the rest of your life ahead of you to not only to fix the little bit of damage you've done, okay, which in time will seem inconsequential, but also then progress, make the best of your lives. And for that, yeah, I wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay sane. There will be a Patreon link in the description below. If you want to support me that way, it's very much appreciated. If not, just like, subscribe, do all that great YouTuber stuff, and I really appreciate it. Have a great day.